So this last video in this lecture on the G component, the genotype component of Canadian cropping systems, is going to focus on forage production. And I wanted to talk about forages at some point in this series of 4 lectures, and I wasn't really sure where it would fit, but I figured, forages are genotypes, they're different species, and we haven't really talked about them yet in class, and we won't really mention them after this video. So this is where forages are going, and this is the last video of the G lecture. So the first point here is that Canadian forage production is heavily concentrated in Western Canada. So that's the Fraser River Valley, the Peace River Valley, and parts of the prairies, the Western prairies. Ontario and Quebec, there's definitely forages. There's pasture, there's hay, but it's a much smaller component of the cropping systems. Okay, there are pockets, for example, in Eastern Ontario and Northern Ontario that have quite a bit of forage, but that's changing. It's going down, being replaced by grains. This is a list of the most common species of forages found in Canadian cropping systems, you could say. You can see the list is comprised of both grasses and legumes. We also have annuals as well as perennials. So the annuals like corn or cereals like oats would primarily be for silage or haylage, harvested feed. So we have quite a mix of different types of species grown in Canada. So alfalfa is probably the most common forage in Ontario, not necessarily in all of Canada, but certainly it is the queen of forages here in the province. It's a perennial crop, it's a legume. It's the typical management is to grow it for 3 years, and then that field is rotated into a different crop. It's primarily grown. Alfalfa needs to be grown on well-drained land. That can be accomplished by tile drainage or a sandier soil texture, or else winter survival is going to be an issue. Timothy is a common grass species grown as forage in the province. It's also a perennial, obviously not a legume, and like alfalfa, it's harvested for stored feed. So Timothy hay is quite common in Ontario. Okay, so this is not generally grazed. Smooth brome grass is a species commonly found in Ontario pastures. The popularity of different pasture species varies from decade to decade in Ontario. It fluctuates for reasons like seed price, winter kill events, which require reseeding of pastures, and so on. So the popularity of something like smooth brome grass is going to fluctuate, but this is what you would typically wouldn't be uncommon to see in pastures. When forage is mechanically harvested, that is harvested by the farmer to be stored and fed to livestock at some later point, the timing of that harvest is going to have a huge impact on the total dry matter harvested and the quality of that forage. So trying to maximize biomass, that's an easy one. The longer a farmer waits to harvest that forage, the larger it's going to grow and the more biomass that will be harvested. But quality is trickier, and there's often an inverse relationship between dry matter and forage quality. So as a livestock producer, this is a simplification, but what a livestock producer is trying to do is maximize the intake of their animals, the intake of nutrients, things like protein that help build muscles, maximize carbohydrates that can be utilized to that animal, to increase weight gain or to increase milk production or what have you. And so the longer a farmer waits, the larger that crop grows. Okay, typically once it gets past the booting stage, that plant is going to start accumulating not nutrients, not digestible carbohydrates, but fiber and things like lignin, which that animals cannot digest. And so if a farmer waits too long to harvest the crop, a low quality crop will be one that has a lot of biomass, but when an animal eats it, it's actually not absorbing, it's not gaining any weight, it's not absorbing the nutrients very well. Again, because of this excess in components like lignin. So the objective is to make sure you have good quality forage, but also enough of it to feed your animals. So it's a trade-off there. Once that forage is harvested, it needs to be stored for animal use in a way that retains maximum amount of nutrients and energy for that animal. So drying down that forage as quickly as possible and as evenly as possible is one important way to conserve forage, and that's what we call hay. That forage is dried normally in the field, and then it's packed into bales where it can be stored and fed to animals. The next other common way to store feed is by pickling it, essentially fermenting that forage and preserving it for, again, later use. And that process is typically called haylage or silage. You're essentially harvesting that forage. You're not drying it down, so it's high moisture, and it's being used to feed animals at a later date, maximizing the retention of nutrients and energy. So feed preserved in this way is often wrapped to exclude air. Introducing air into the fermentation process, into the haylage or silage, will spoil. And so farmers will take measures to minimize any oxygen in the haylage. Livestock harvesting or pasture grazing is an alternative to mechanically harvesting and storing feed. It's the animals actually going out onto the pasture and collecting that feed themselves and eating it right then and there. So farmers will often use a mix of both, grazing on pasture and then, specific stands that are meant for hay or silage, and they'll use both. And, quite simply in Canada, the fact is that we don't have a 365-day growing season. And so keeping animals on pasture year round is essentially almost impossible. And so farmers rely on stored feed to get the animals through winter months. And so they'll often use a mix of both. So farmers who are managing pastures are trying to maximize animal weight gain per acre, or whatever other animal output per acre. And that is determined by the quantity and quality of forages. So they need to manage, for example, the mix of species that are on that pasture to make sure that the grass or legume species that are surviving and persisting on that pasture, are palatable, that the animals want to eat them, and that they're of high quality. Farmers also have to ensure that the pasture is being grazed at the time when those species are at their maximum quality. And again, that's typically before or just around booting. So just before flowering, essentially, when you have the maximum quality. So there's 4 kinds of pastures, and let's just go through each of them quickly. So I'm organizing these categories in terms of the amount of effort required on the farmer's part. And so the lowest effort type of pasture is just natural, unimproved pasture. It's basically a natural ecosystem. The farmer is not really manipulating in any way. So established pastures require more management and decision-making on the part of the farmer. So he or she selects the actual species to be grown, seeding those species. And, the mix of species that they select, normally it's a mixture, but it might not be. Might be just one species. The species they select depends on a whole host of factors, such as drainage class, the length of the growing season, and their management objectives. And so one thing that farmers need to manage is once they've seeded that pasture and selected their species, they need to ensure that they're managing that species mix, because as animals graze that pasture, they are, by the choices of what they're grazing and what time they're grazing, they're altering succession patterns, right? Some species are going to increase in frequency and some species may not. And so the farmers needs to pay attention to ensure that, the species they want and the proportions they want are persisting on that pasture. Improved pastures are essentially established pastures that are being well maintained, reseeded when needed, fertilized, harrowed, weeds are controlled, or fenced to improve productivity and utilization. Most pastures are seeded with perennial species, ones that survive for multiple years, and that's to save the farmer the time and cost of having to reseed a pasture every single year. But there's increasingly opportunities in the province to graze animals on annual plants. A number of opportunities that I think farmers are going to increasingly take advantage of as land prices go up. So one option is to graze animals on cover crops. So after that main crop like wheat is harvested, sowing a cover crop, letting that cover crop grow, and then at the optimum timing, pasturing animals, putting animals on that land to graze. This is increasingly common, especially with younger livestock farmers. There's creative arrangements, so livestock farmers might not have access to land, but their neighbors, what they can do is say, "Hey, I'll pay for the cover crop seed, and I'll pay to seed that cover crop if you just give me free access to your land. Let my animals graze that cover crop." And that's often a beneficial arrangement for both parties, the landowner and the farmer who's going to utilize that land for their animals. There's also opportunities to graze stover. Okay, so in terms of residue management, which was an issue that I covered in a previous video, that's a possible residue management, just letting animals graze on stover. And so there's a number of niches or opportunities that Ontario farmers, entrepreneurial ones, can take advantage of. So for a grass or legume species to be considered grazing tolerant and to be recommended for farmers to seed in pastures, they need to meet a couple of requirements. Obviously, they need to be tolerant to being grazed, and that means having 75% or more of their above ground growth eaten. They also need to be tolerant to being, stepped on by animals. And so, for species to be grazing tolerant, so to speak, they need to have their meristems or growth points at or near the soil surface. So, those meristems are intact, they're not eaten by the animal. These species also need to be able to rapidly regrow after, their tops are grazed. And to rapidly regrow, they need to be able to store nutrients in that lower stem and root system. So, think about it. When the tops of these grasses or legumes are grazed, they lose their leaves, and so they can't photosynthesize very, very much, if at all. And so to regrow, they have to rely on stored carbohydrates, stored nutrients. And so having those large energy stores is very important for pasture species to regrow quickly. It's important to ensure that pastures are not overgrazed. In other words, keeping those animals out on a piece of land for too long. Overgrazing, when those animals just eat, the entire above ground plant, just right down to the soil, that removes the energy stores. It reduces rooting depth, and it results in weak, drought-prone plants that do not regrow very quickly, if at all. And so with overgrazing, you end up promoting species that are unpalatable and that don't have good nutritive value because the animals were preferentially overgrazed on, those nutrient-dense, tasty plant species. In many drier parts of the world, overgrazing has contributed to this pattern of desertification. And that's because overgrazing, kills plants, and without plants, you don't have roots to hold down soil, and you can get lots of erosion and eventually, desertification of an ecosystem. So there's a number of grazing management strategies that farmers can use to, again, maximize weight gain or animal output per acre of pasture and minimize that risk of overgrazing. So here's just a list of different types of grazing strategies. I won't go through them. So you don't need to know anything about these for the purposes of this course. This is about plant agriculture, but there is a whole forages course you can take at this university, and you should if you're interested.